Welcome to the second day of the 2025 Grad Futures Forum Graduate Student Professional Development Conference, hosted by the Graduate School at Princeton University. My name is Amanda Peacock, and I'm the Graduate Student Professional Development Coordinator on the Grad Futures team. Now in its sixth year, we're thrilled to host another full week of transformative professional development and career exploration for our diverse graduate community of talented scholars, researchers, and leaders at Princeton and other institutions. With participants from more than 60+ graduate institutions across the globe and counting, we come together to learn, explore, and forge meaningful connections. This year's conference theme, Meeting the Moment, reflects our collective commitment to navigating current challenges with purpose and vision. We're deeply grateful to our exceptional speakers and panelists who will share their expertise, practical advice, and inspiration throughout the week. Our team has carefully crafted a program that aims to empower you with clarity, practical skills, valuable connections, and a renewed sense of agency. While there may be questions for which none of us have the answers right now, we are dedicated to providing information and support with real-time relevance to your success in graduate school and beyond. We hope you will join us for additional sessions throughout the week and that you find the conference enriching and inspiring. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Matt Sigelman is the president of the Burning Glass Institute and a senior advisor at the Harvard Project on the Workforce. He has dedicated his entire career to unlocking new avenues for mobility, opportunity, and equity through skills. Earlier in his career, he and his team created the field of real-time labor market data, a breakthrough innovation that has transformed the way that policymakers, researchers, employers, education institutions, and workers understand, plan for, and connect with the world of work. By mining billions of job openings and career histories, Matt led the company that has now become Lightcast and became a leading authority on the global market for talent by harnessing advanced AI and natural language processing to render data that provides a granular look at the changing landscape of opportunity. We've worked with Matt over the years to track labor market data and demand for PhDs, and we're so excited for him to return for a third time to the Grad Futures Forum. Matt will be joined for a fireside chat after his talk by James Van Wyk, Assistant Dean for Professional Development. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be back. So I'm looking forward to this conversation today. Before I begin, I want to speak for a moment about what defines and what drives the job market. We tend to naturally enough think about a labor market as being defined by, well, jobs. And if you were to say that, you would be only partially right. The truth of the matter is that jobs have a DNA, and the genome of the job market is skills. Skills define each job. They define the relationships between each job, and they define the pathways of mobility that move through our careers. Also, very importantly, skills are what define the dynamism that we see most. We see so much about how jobs are changing. We have so much concern about which jobs are going to still be present in a world of AI and which jobs are going to go away. But the reality is that most of the kind of dynamism that we're seeing today is a dynamism of skills. So what I want to do is share with you a little bit about what we've learned from analyzing billions of job openings over the past 20 years. And then, very importantly, look at the kinds of changes that our models suggest that are forthcoming in the world of AI. Just before I do that, I do also want to give a quick overview of what the Burning Glass Institute is. The Burning Glass Institute is a fully independent nonprofit research center that we started 3 years ago. The idea behind it is this. There are powerful novel data sets that exist today. Many of you on this call have been working in whatever field you're in, have been working with kind of novel big data sets that didn't exist before, that are opening up whole new avenues of exploration. And yet, what we also find is that the basic premise that if you just put data out there, transformative things will happen is, well, not quite right. And so the Burning Glass Institute exists to be able to advance research and practice at the intersection of the future of work and the future of learning by analyzing an array of novel data sets in ways that model on top of them to solve fundamental problems, problems that can stand in the way of greater economic mobility, problems that stand in the way of better outcomes for learning and work, and problems that stand in the way of community prosperity. So I'll with that as introduction, I'll start in. So first, I mentioned before that we see a tremendous amount of dynamism in the job market today, and I think it's important to unpack that. What does that mean when we say that skills are changing? You often hear people speaking of a half-life of skills. The reality is, from a study that we undertook a couple of years ago, together with our colleagues at the Boston Consulting Group, we found that the average U.S. occupation has seen 37% of its skills replaced in just the prior 5 years. 37% sounds like a pretty big number, but it's actually, when you sort of put it in context, by the way, the quartile of jobs that are most disrupted, rather, about 3/4 of their skills have been replaced. When you think about that number, 37%, think, as 37% of the catalog of a traditional higher education institution changed. Of course not. In fact, accreditors don't allow more than 10% of a program's curriculum to change. Then ask yourself this, what does it take to keep up with that? Now, we would normally sort of look at this and say, well, this is probably mostly about tech change. We know that in any given field, there's new technologies and therefore new sets of skills that people need to acquire, and that seems probably right. But the truth turns out to be far more complex. And in fact, the changes that we're seeing are far more profound. What we're seeing instead is skills traveling across domains, showing up in places that they didn't exist in the past. Take the example that you see on the right side of this chart, the difference between an accountant on the one side and a data scientist on another side. Fun fact, historically, accountants were kind of the data scientists of the early 19th century before, just like everyone wants to be a data scientist today. Maybe not all of you, hopefully not all of you, but as many people want to be data scientists today, it's sort of a hot job. Before the Industrial Revolution, you managed your firm by the gold that was in your purse. You didn't really need accountants. So all of a sudden they came out of nowhere and there was a lot of demand. But the reason why I'm comparing them is not because of the difference or the similarity across historical epochs. But if I were to ask you, what are the skills you need to be an accountant? You would say, well, no duh, accounting skills. But if I were to ask you, what are the skills you need to be a data scientist? If you were to actually analyze what do employers look for, even more than data skills, it turns out they actually are looking for a set of programming skills. They do ask for data skills. And in addition, they're asking for business skills because we hire data scientists to solve business problems. And yet those three different skill sets are seldom live in the same department or even faculty in many universities. They are different hats that get worn that are seldom worn on the same head. And yet more and more jobs are asking people to bridge across domains. Now let's think about the consequences of these skill changes. So think about what happens here for a mechanical engineer. And as you can imagine, in a job like mechanical engineering, we're starting to see emerging specialties. And in fact, we've got a whole branch of analysis that we're looking at right now to try to understand the formation of new jobs. And in many cases, they represent spin-outs out of existing jobs. But you can kind of see that here. So what you're seeing on the left is what are the skills that employers ask for when they are looking for a mechanical engineer. But what you're seeing on the right are the skills that a mechanical engineer needs, the top skills that employers are looking for when they look for a mechanical engineer who's working in V2I systems. or on the far right, the skills that a mechanical engineer would need if they're working on autonomous systems. And what you can see is there's actually very little commonality with the skills of a traditional mechanical engineer. Put differently, we tend to assume that when a job needs some new skill, that this is just going to be cut and paste. Okay, fine, I can learn that skill. I used to use SPSS, and then I use SAS, and now I use R, and I can just replace it. And some skills work that way. But in a lot of cases, we're finding that emerging skills aren't just cut and paste. Here's an example of actuaries. Um, you probably don't think terribly often about actuaries, but they do think about you. What you're seeing on the left is the skills that we typically associate with an actuary, what employers are asking for when they hire for actuaries. Now, interestingly enough, what actuaries do, not surprisingly, is computational math. Well, machine learning does computational math at greater scale. We're starting to see some actuaries use machine learning. What you're seeing on the right is this. When you try to hire for an actuary with ML skills, what skills does that job require? And you can compare that with again, on the left, the normal skills of of a regular actuary. And what you can see is it's an entirely different set of skills because all the computational math that they used to be doing, they're not doing anymore. And instead, it's a whole nother set of skills that shows up. So what this says is that as we see emerging technologies come into the market, the consequences can be very significant, not just in jobs going away or jobs being born, but in terms of the requirements, what's the knowledge and skills it takes to land a job. So with that, I want to sort of get to, I know what many people are wondering about specifically in this session, which is generative AI, and what are the kind of impacts that we can look forward to. First, I always want to sort of start here. Some of you may be familiar with this, but for those who aren't, I think it's worth considering the fact that we see that in past ways of automation, sometimes the effects haven't borne out the way we would have expected. Here's an example of ATM machines. As we probably don't think too often about what the ATM stands for, automated teller machine. One would have expected that when ATMs showed up on the scene in the late 70s, early 80s, that you would have seen a significant reduction in demand for tellers. In fact, through about 10 years ago, we kept seeing the number of tellers in the US go up. And so what this reflects is this, that often automation, by bringing new efficiency, changes core unit economics. And what that essentially means is that as we see automation take on human tasks, what it's actually doing is creating new demand. This is a classic example of demand stimulation. And so a lot of fields right now where you look at AI models and you can say, gee, there's a lot of overlap between AI capabilities and what people are doing. Does that mean that there's going to be no opportunity available for me? Actually, in a lot of those fields, especially in those fields, we're going to see dramatically greater demand. Think about this. Think about all the veins of data that exist out there today, which go untapped, underanalyzed, because frankly, in order for them to be analyzed right now, you need to use a lot of data science time that just doesn't cost justify. When data science time becomes a lot effectively cheaper because you're using less of it per analysis, then there's going to be all sorts of veins of rich data that will get tapped. So I think I want to frame that as sort of an optimistic note, but at the same time, I do want to speak to some of the kinds of transformations that we're seeing that may have particular implication for how we start careers and how we advance our careers over time. This is from a report that's forthcoming. We just released an article in Harvard Business Review last week on this and have a fuller report, which will be due out in the next few weeks, looking at the impact of generative AI on expertise. both the expertise it takes to access jobs and the expertise that helps people advance their careers over time. And here's what we found. We found that there's one of the key motors of transformation of AI that AI will have is actually not so much on jobs, but on learning curves for those jobs. And you can actually proxy learning curves by looking at earning curves, by looking at earnings dispersions within fields. In a lot of fields, there are significant dispersions. And actually, the slope of those pay curves corresponds in most fields to productivity increase over time. And so what it allows us to do is understand, on the one hand, how much of a barrier is learning to get into a field. And then on the other, how much learning people do on the job today. So if we take the example of those first jobs, ones that have a significant knowledge barrier to get in, but often have a fairly shallow slope. Those are jobs where you need to learn a body of knowledge. There's domain expertise that needs to be overcome. And by the way, AI is actually pretty good at giving us access to knowledge. And in those kinds of jobs, we actually may see significantly more opportunity. That's the good news for those jobs. The bad news is that the kinds of jobs where people's productivity doesn't go up over time tend not to be the kind of high value jobs that you might want to step into. Give you an example. There are, in fact, it seems weird to say that in some jobs, good performance is a ceiling. But if you think about a bus driver, for example, whether you're a new hire or whether you've been on the job for 20 years, show up on time, don't crash the bus. There's not a real opportunity for outperformance, and that's why you see those curves be flat. Those kinds of jobs, maybe not bus driving itself, but in a lot of cases, customer service, sort of sets of jobs where there's an expertise that you need to learn, that you can learn in a classroom. Generative AI can facilitate, can help us bring down social capital barriers like writing, language proficiency. But in many other jobs, the slope is actually fairly steep. Once we get into the job, and we may still need knowledge to get into the job, there's a lot of expertise that we accrue over time. Actually, we were talking before about data scientists, and that's a great example of the kind of job that we're talking about. If you look at the difference in pay between an entry-level data scientist and one who's got significant proficiency in the field, it's quite meaningful difference. What we then do is we modeled the skills for entry-level opportunity versus for a more advanced opportunity. And we looked at the kinds of the expected generative AI overlaps with those skills. And in many of those jobs, we find significantly more overlap between generative AI capabilities and the capabilities that are needed at the entry level than perhaps not so surprisingly at the expert level. Think about this morning when you were at your breakfast table and you were looking at your milk carton. There was probably a long paean to the meadow in which the cows were grazing to produce such beautiful creamy milk. And I'm sure somewhere there was a marketing assistant who was very proud of that copy. I hate to break it to them, but the reality is that ChatGPT could have written it just fine. That doesn't mean there's not a need for marketing people. In fact, you're going to need senior marketing people who know how to know what kind of copy is needed, what the target demographic is that you're trying to speak to, and so forth. But the question is this: if we don't need the junior marketing person, how do people get into the field? It's a problem for companies as you sort of think about what it means for talent pipelines. Where does the talent come from? It also portends potential changes in the shape of organizations as we see different jobs move across their learning curves in different ways. If a normal organization is shaped to take lots of people at the entry level, and some of them advance over time and become managers and leaders from there. What does it mean if there's a lot less entry-level opportunity? But I think more importantly for this conversation, what does it mean for people in their careers? How do we start our careers in the middle? And so it speaks to the kind of capabilities that we're going to need. A lot of the analysis around AI has been around tasks and kind of task impacts. But some of the biggest implications that we see are really about the skills that are needed. Not surprisingly, we see the skills needed in any given job changing, some becoming more important, some going away. But what is fascinating to look at is how the effects of automation and augmentation impact the sets of skills you need. We first tried to step into this conundrum that I think a lot of people, this tug of war that we hear a lot of economists and futurists debating, whether AI will augment human endeavor, or whether it's going to automate away our efforts. We created a set of statistical models to try to be able to understand the impacts. And when we finished those models, we took a look at what came out the other end, and we said, wow, we really screwed this up, because there's a set of skills that show up at top of both of those lists. And wait a second, we thought we were trying to settle once and for all what's getting augmented and what's automated. And then we realized is that, in fact, there are sets of capabilities where AI both makes us more efficient and more effective at the same time. You're seeing some of those on the right. These are the new power skills of the 21st century. Think about something even like writing, where there's so much that we know about. Many of us have used AI to our writing. And I think from your own use, one of the things you'd probably learn is, from what you're probably familiar with, is AI is best at perhaps putting sentences on a page, but it doesn't frame your thoughts for you. It can put together, notwithstanding that the undergraduates whom you may have in your classes may think otherwise, but AI works best in supplementing the writing that we do. We'll need different kinds of writing skills. But writing is, in fact, one of those kinds of places where we become both more efficient and more effective. It's a new power skill. We need to make sure that all of us are equipped with those new power skills for the 21st century. But I want to point to one other aspect of AI, which I think is really important, perhaps profound. And then we'll talk about some strategies for how to manage your career in this changing landscape. Remember I said a minute ago that the skills of every job are getting changed? Well, think about, how do people move, not just into their jobs, but how do people move across their jobs over time? The average American makes 12 career transitions over the course of their career. Each transition, what we're doing is we're building on the skills that we were just using in our prior job. And then we're perhaps acquiring some new skills to bridge gaps, and we're stepping up into a new opportunity. Skills or rather jobs are kind of like pack animals in that they travel together, and they travel together based upon the skills they required. This is a cluster map. Each of these colors represents a different career area. So green jobs, maybe the bottom right, maybe engineering jobs, and yellow jobs, maybe computational jobs, whatever. You kind of get the picture from there. And their relationships are based on the proximity of the skills that they have. Now imagine all of the skills change. When we model this, what we're finding is that there's essentially a mixing that's going on. So, on the left, this is your brain. On the right, this is your brain on drugs. It doesn't mean that there aren't career paths anymore. But the career paths that get us from point A to point B to point C, the ones that we're used to understanding, those are all going to get shaken up. That means new sets of opportunities on the one hand, and it means that some of the existing ones may get closed down. And so what it says is that each of us needs to, A, have our antennae up, and make sure that we're understanding where are those transitions, and B, that we're paying close attention to the skills that we have. You're hearing probably a lot of voices say things like, you don't need coding skills, you don't need data skills anymore because AI is going to do all those. All the data that we've seen thus far make us rather skeptical. It's too early to know terribly much with certainty in the world of generative AI. But I would use the analogy from past waves of an automation of Microsoft Excel. Before there was Microsoft Excel, it's kind of hard for any of us to imagine what it would have been like to just even use basic data, to do basic analysis, the kind of stuff that we all do every day. I remember my mom had a big ledger that she had to work in. Try doing a discounted cash flow without Microsoft Excel. So what Microsoft Excel did is it didn't mean that people didn't use data anymore. It means that many more of us are equipped to do it, perhaps at a less expert level. And so it said that you don't no longer need expertise to use data, but it means that many more of us need it. So I would say that it's going to be very important for each of us to make sure that we're actually acquiring a good proficiency in coding and data science, regardless of whether those are directions that, even if those are occupations that you may not be interested in, those are capabilities that many more of us will need. Also, one other note on AI, it's worth sort of thinking through how its impacts will vary. AI will impact skills define jobs, and each sector and each company have a different occupational contours. And so you can use that to be able to say, first of all, across sectors, how much AI impact are we likely to see? And even within a sector, here on the right, you're seeing different retail companies. You can see how there can be rather profound differences in the level of AI impact. So I want to just take a minute or two more to talk about what we can do about all this. So first of all, I want to point out that what we've seen overall is that advanced degrees really have a lot of value. This is from data that we've looked at of underemployment, people being employed beneath their level of education. It's highly prevalent among people with just a college degree, much less prevalent among people with advanced degrees. But one of the key things that is an important strategy as you navigate your career in this changing landscape is to pay attention to which skills add value to your career. This is some data of undergraduate degrees, but we have seen the same kind of phenomenon bear out. What we've looked at is a set of common degrees here, and you can see in any given program of study, there are certain sets of skills that will make you more valuable. So somebody working who studies in an undergraduate liberal arts field, for example, who gets strategic planning skills, that's the difference between going and working in a nonprofit at the front desk and being able to be key to shaping the plans of that nonprofit. That person is making 20% more. Someone who has strong technical writing skills is making considerably more than somebody without those skills, even again, relative to other liberal arts majors. I would also point out the same as what we also see is that when employers are hiring PhDs in a given field, it's specifically because they are looking for people with a more advanced skill set. We found that there's a non-trivial number of PhDs who get hired into UI UX fields, often, for example, anthropologists or other social scientists who have done a lot of observation in the field. And you can see the difference between the skills employers are looking for on the left for PhDs in that field versus for others. So the skills that you're acquiring are valuable. And again, sort of giving thought to that, doing your desk research to understand what are the skills that employers will value for you distinctively, and then making sure, importantly, that you're acquiring the core foundations. The core foundations of a doctoral degree, those are the skills that are most valuable across the highest value work. If you look at the jobs that are growing fastest, that pay the most, there's a set of transversal skills. You can see some of them on the left. They are, of course, core human skills, the kind of bedrocks of a liberal arts degree, but they're also digital skills, they're data skills, and often business skills. Think about something like project management, which you need regardless of whether you are somebody going into tech, or whether you're a nurse who's managing care across providers. Overall, my friend and colleague at the Harvard Project on the workforce, David Deming, excuse me, has shown is that the sets of jobs that have been growing fastest are the ones that are bridging across core social skills and core quantitative skills. I want to finish here with this thought. Be weird to say that I'm going to end a talk on what I hope will be an inspiring note about productivity, but give me a shot. You know, most of us flinch when we hear people talking about productivity because it raises images in our head of Frederick Taylor and management science and people with white lab coats and stopwatches and clipboards. Do you know why we flinch when we think about productivity that way? Why we think, why in fact we associate productivity with that? Well, it's this. Productivity, as you may know, is a ratio. It's the ratio of the value of labor's output to the cost of its input. Whenever we've tried to affect productivity in the past, it's been almost always by focusing on the denominator, the cost of labor. How do we use less labor? How do we use cheaper labor? How do we automate labor away? We almost never think about how to increase the value of the numerator. The opportunity that you have in your career at a time that we're shifting from an industrial economy to a knowledge economy is to make your endeavors worth more. The way that we make our endeavors worth more is by bringing greater capability, greater potential, and by bringing greater skill to our work. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and we'll now turn over to James.
Matt, this was encouraging, and you're right. I'd never heard somebody say, "Now for an inspiring moment, we're going to focus on productivity." But that was I think a great cap to your talk. And now let's move into a discussion. Please, everyone, feel free to use the Q&A to share questions in the chat. Matt, as you can tell, is a adept communicator. He can weave some of the questions into our conversation. You say jobs are the DNA and the genome is skills. You also said most of the dynamism we're seeing is a dynamism of skills. And I wonder, in the context of PhD education, what are some implications for PhDs of the move to skills-based hiring versus credentials-based hiring? And I just want to add one other variable here, which is time to degree for PhDs, which is usually 5 or 6 years, let's say, optimistically speaking. It can take a long time to get a PhD. So what are some practical ways PhDs can react and adjust to the landscape of skills-based hiring, given that they're going to start a program, they're going to be there for 5 or 6 years, and much of their time is going to be devoted to a particular kind of training?
So I think there's a couple things I'd like to unpack there. Let's first start with skills-based hiring, and then we'll also sort of talk about the longitude, and keep me honest on that, because plenty that we can talk about on either of those. But I think in terms of skills-based hiring, one of the things that let me first just define terms for everybody. If you're not familiar with the idea, there's a growing number of employers who are recognizing, particularly amidst the kind of talent shortages they have, and also surrounding their equity concerns, a desire to build a more diverse workforce, that they've been constructing barriers, that there's a lot of jobs that are requiring degrees that frankly aren't needed. So, you would see a very high percentage, for example, of admins where the job posting is saying you need to have a college degree, and only about 20% or so, I may be slightly off in that figure, of the U.S. workforce working in that role actually has one. So you're creating this kind of credential gap. And so for all of these reasons, in some cases, for some employers, it's political about their lack of confidence in higher education. For others, it's in order to build a more diverse workforce. And for many of them, it's because they want to be able to attract more talent. They're saying, well, gee, I mean, what if we take the degree requirements out? So two things I would just offer perhaps as a bit of reassurance for this audience. First, and this is less reassurance, I think it's not necessarily positive, but employers are actually really struggling to implement this. It's a great idea, but they haven't figured out if the degree is a signal, meant essentially a proxy for talent assessment, for what capabilities people bring. What employers haven't figured out is what to replace it with. So try going to a hiring manager and saying, okay, we don't want you to look at whether somebody has a degree, but we actually don't have any other basis for helping you establish whether somebody brings skills and capabilities. Then guess what? The CEO says we're not hiring for degrees anymore, but the hiring managers keep doing it. In fact, we did some analysis last year that's cited quite a bit, where we found was that only about less than 3 in 100 people, incremental non-degreed hires are being brought into jobs that shed their degree requirements. So, I think there's a while before we have to really worry about it being a problem. But I think particularly for this audience, I point out, for example, the example of the UI UX developer, and what are the capabilities that are needed at the PhD level. The kinds of work that graduate students might be thinking about undertaking if they're not choosing to make their contributions in academia. These are jobs that are looking for advanced levels of skill proficiency. It's also why I think the idea of starting your career in the middle that we discussed before is maybe a little bit less of a problem for people in this audience. On the one hand, you've been for several years working in a field that may not be directly applied, and that's a challenge. But on the other hand, you're approaching the field with a greater level of expertise and proficiency than somebody would be doing if they were just coming out of undergraduate. Now, you talked, James, about this question of how do we manage the longitude of a program of study that could take 5, 6, 7 years, and I think the key thing here is this. I think it's important to make sure that you're staying close to the fields that you're interested in, that you're staying close to how they're evolving, and that you're sort of managing your career opportunities a bit like a funnel, right? So when you're first entering, when you're pre-generals, the chances that you really kind of know where you're aiming to land 6 years later, and that the market is still going to be what you think it's going to be, right? Not so clear, and not so sure that it matters. But 2 years out, 1 year out, you really do need to be thinking about these things. And so it's not so much about shifting the longitude as much as it is taking advantage of that longitude, recognizing that there's a lot of uncertainty when you come in. You're a lot closer to opportunity when you're midway through your studies, and starting to use some of that time when you're not writing your thesis to be doing your lab research or whatever it is, to really be making sure, okay, are there a couple of extra skills I should be acquiring on the side? That's a great way to turn that, what could be risk, into opportunity.
Yeah, is it fair to say then that you're approaching 2 years out from your dissertation defense, or you're wrapping up a PhD? You would then start looking at the skills that recur in the job fields that are most interesting to you. So you mentioned passion area before, and then aligning that with the skills you see most consistently, and then saying, all right, I have a 2-year window. This skill is not going away. It's in all the job ads that I care about. What's my plan to acquire that skill over the next 2 years? And then as you get closer, you might see you know, skills starting to pop up like mushrooms because they're more easily acquirable. And then you know, okay, I need to get project management over these next 2 years, but this new skill that's popping up, I also need that because it's in, 50 out of the 60 jobs that I think are interesting.
Two things that you said that I want to amplify. The first is about a really important and I think underappreciated mechanism for doing your homework. And that's looking at job openings. Right. So I think a lot of us are looking for some magic box. There are great data sets that are out there. Unfortunately, they tend not to be public. But no matter, right? I think if you were to say, hey, look, this is a field I'm really interested in entering, just go and read 20 or 30 job postings. They're not hard to find. And what are the consistent set of things? So that's number one. Number two, something else that you just said, which I think is really important, is thinking about not only the longitude of your studies, but realizing that different skills have different longitudes.
Mm.
There's some sets of capabilities that you're going to want to build that are going to be more transversal and which may take longer. And sort of front loading some of that skill development. If you're working in comp lit, let's say, and nonetheless you actually think you probably need to have more robust data skills than your dissertation probably requires. You have other analytical skills, but maybe not data analysis, or coding skills or whatever. Like, okay, that may take a little longer. Then there's, I think, specific instantiations of those skills. And being able to say, okay, what's the flavor of the day? I can pick that up once I've developed good computational thinking, right? Whatever, if today's Python becomes tomorrow's something else, fair enough. Like that's easily enough adjusted. And most of us are already through our studies used to picking up new instantiations of core skills in a rapid way.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Matt, thanks for that. Can you speak? Yeah, I saw transversal on one of your slides. I don't think you said it in your talk, but can you talk about what do you mean when you say transversal?
So what we mean by that is this. If you look across what are the skills that are most needed across the jobs that are most valuable, you can kind of see that there's sets of skills that just cut across, right? We're used to thinking about specific domains of work and thinking that there are specific skills to those domains, but actually a lot of them are common across fields. And particularly when we sort of say, okay, what are the jobs that are most valuable? What we find is that there are a lot more commonalities than you would think. And if you can acquire those kinds of building blocks, then again, think of it like, in the world of product design, you think about a funnel shape to the way you manage a process where you try to keep your options open, wide mouth of the funnel and then narrow later on. Skills work the same way. If we can kind of acquire those core building blocks, then again, you can develop the more specific applied skills over time.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I want to pivot a little bit, come back to the idea of the shifting nature of the definition of expertise. How might that definition be evolving in response to Gen AI capabilities? And what implications do you see this having for graduate level training? And another way to frame this might be, to approach the question as is, and then to think about if you were consulting for an academic department that said, all right, we recognize that in neuroscience, in psychology, in music, in whatever department, we're going to have to revamp graduate training in response to these trends. Where would you start and what would be some, day one recommendations?
So there's a couple of things. So again, just want to double click on this idea that in a lot of fields, and particularly some of the kinds of fields that people might be contemplating who are listening today, these are fields where you know, a lot of the way that we build expertise is over time on the job. And the starting point is where AI has the most overlap, where firms will be very tempted to use that example we talked about before of a marketing assistant. It's very tempting to say, why am I hiring a marketing assistant to write copy? And I don't need so many marketing assistants anymore. And that's true. And yet, this could be very disruptive. It's just, again, disruptive to employers because, okay, I still need the senior people, but where do I get them from?
Right.
But it's equally disruptive, of course, for each of us who are listening today. And I think to your question of how would you manage this? How should an academic department manage this? I think in a couple of ways. One is to recognize that we're going to see the bar get raised. And that means that we need to be refocusing not on the entry-level skills, but we need to be refocusing on the more advanced level skills. Now, again, some of those are going to be hard to acquire, not on the job, but that's not universally the case. We can also start to think about two other things. One, how do we make sure that we're taking opportunities to be out in the field, perhaps a little bit more? I know how much I'm married to an academic, so I very much appreciate how much absolute dedication of focus is required in completing a PhD. To the extent that there are opportunities to be out in the world of work, particularly if you're looking beyond academia when you're done. You know, we have a number of people on our team. We hire a lot of economists and data scientists, and we have a lot of people who are working with us while they're pursuing their PhDs. And I think that's a good example of saying, okay, how do I make sure I'm getting some opportunities to actually start to gain the expertise before I'm hitting the job market?
Yeah, career exploration and experiential learning, you know, core to what we do, getting PhDs out into the world, into, you know, research contexts that are different from academia, but leverage similar skills, and then also show them what they might need to acquire, where they, you know, to transfer into a field like consulting, or, you know, a think tank, or, you know, a for-profit company. So really great. We're getting quite a few questions. I want to share a few from Maria. Maria says, "Hi, Matt. This was an amazing talk. Completely agree, Maria. This is shifting a little bit away from AI, but I'm curious about your thoughts on this current quote unquote frozen job market. You always hear scary things about the long-lasting effects of starting a career during a recession. What advice do you have for early career PhDs leaving academia in this labor market? Do you see this job market unfreezing anytime soon?"
So I think the important thing to look for is what are the kinds of fields that the way I would frame it is this. So first of all, historically, you know, we're not quite in a recession yet. And you know, while we've heard a lot about how the world of software and other tech jobs have frozen, we're certainly seeing a lot of apprehension again from employers. Sometimes even if the AI transformations at the entry level haven't happened yet, there's some anxiety that employers are having, you know, want to invest in and bring on entry level talent into jobs that you think might go away. So these are real concerns. I think a way to manage this is to do some analysis of the broader secular trends that are shaping a field. What are the fields where there seems to be sort of a long-term growth trend that isn't that, you know, we've seen a lot of growth, but maybe now it's going to plateau, but where you know, there's just a market thesis that you can have that the world's going to continue to need more of those. Number two, I would look at demographic trends, and specifically occupational demographics. Where are we seeing fields where the workforce is aging out? or that have struggled to attract high caliber talent, or geographies that have struggled to attract high caliber talent. And then I would put on top of that question, some analysis of what are fields where we're going to see other kinds of factors that are going to reshape that occupation. In general, we know that we're seeing significant potential for long-term talent shortage. The combination of demographic drought, of changes in the kind of educational levels of attainment that people are having, unfortunately, changes in immigration policy. And so I think if you can sort of look at specifically how do they affect different fields, you can place your bets in smarter ways. So that's number one. The second advice I'd offer is that tells you, okay, look, it may be hard to land, but at least you're aiming toward a field that, despite initial turbulence, is going to be going somewhere. But I think the other question is, how do you stand out? And in a soft hiring market, what's really important is to make sure that you have the capabilities that put you ahead of others who are competing for those same jobs. And that's why sort of saying, hey, what are the skills that are most sought after? What are the skills that command market premiums? If you can master those, then you're in a catbird seat, even in a soft job market.
That's really great. So look at the broad, big picture, identify some trends, but then also look within and discover, the distinctives that make you capable of solving a problem maybe no one else could solve for organizations that are seeing this growth. That's really, really helpful framing. Cecilia asks a meta question, which is about how does Burning Glass Institute gather the job posting data? So maybe we're getting in the proprietary area, but Cecilia notes LinkedIn seems to be a great source, but I don't think they allow scraping. So I'd like to understand the coverage, both quantitative and qualitatively. That is, how large are the gaps and where are they?
Yeah. So the Burning Glass Institute itself is what we find is that there's actually a lot of these data sets that are out there today. We on job postings, we license data currently from Lightcast, the company which I founded and built over years. We've licensed a lot of other data sets as well. First of all, scraping technology has gotten quite good, and there's a game of cat and mouse that gets managed, and being able to scrape those sites. But these have been actually, there's a lot of academic labor market economists who are using these kinds of data sets, and many of them have done validations of the data sets. I think what you'll find is that there's a general consensus that about in a developed economy like the US, about 85% of jobs are represented. There are certainly skews. And just like with any data set, we'll have biases and you just have to control for them. So for example, we know that union trades tend to hire through what they call the hiring hall. And so you don't see those show up online at the same concentrations. The same is true, by the way. We've built at the Institute our own data set. We started with some licensed data and have done a ton to enhance the data set of career histories. So we have career histories on 65 million US workers, about 40% of the US workforce. You would think that the kind of career histories you'd find online, resumes, LinkedIn profiles, things like that, would mean that you'd have a seriously professional skew. We've been surprised. We recently were trying to understand what happens to workers at a specific fast food restaurant and how do they advance their careers and do they wind up getting stuck? And we found for that one restaurant, we found 480,000 career histories that had at least one experience in a restaurant role at that. So you're seeing more and more data representation online, and the real question is, how do you interpret it? How do you apply the ontologies? How do you do the data structuring to make it? tell us important things about how about the twists, turns, and tangles that move through people's careers and how that drives economic mobility and career success.
Well, that's really helpful. Thank you. So last question from Faru, great partner of Grad Futures from NJ Edge. Faru asks, how should graduate programs evolve their curricula and mentorship models to ensure graduate students are not just users of generative AI, but also critical thinkers and innovators who can shape its development and ethical use? Great
So
question.
I think it is a great question, and what I'll say is this: the capabilities that graduate students are developing at their core are the capabilities of innovation. And what they are, those capabilities are not just the kind of technical capabilities. Those capabilities are really about managing and driving the process of innovation. And so I think when, I think there's certainly some fields where, we all just kind of turn generative AI on autopilot. What I hope for is much more often the case for people on this call is that we're being strategic about the context in which we use generative AI, the extent to which we are able to apply AI to key steps in that innovation process that underlies all graduate studies, is the extent to which we will be driving generative AI as opposed to simply being users of it or perhaps being driven by it.
Well said. Well said. We are at time. I know you had a hard stop, so I really appreciate the hour. Thanks everyone for sticking with us throughout the hour, for your great questions, for your attention. But please join me in thanking Matt in the chat for his talk.